Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, his new book is called Smart, Wrong, and Lucky, The Origin Stories of Baseball's Unexpected Stars. Jonathan Mayo, the writer, joins me on the show. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit about your background before we get into the book, because you write for MLB.com, you cover MLB Pipeline. You got into, looking at evaluating talent. How did you land at that as a career?
Some of it was kind of professional survival. I did major league stuff. Started back a long time ago. I was the first staff writer MLB.com ever hired in 1999. And then, Baseball Advanced Media happened. We started expanding and we had a lot of national writers, and there's only so many stories to go around. And I always liked doing prospect stuff, and we covered the draft every year, which, I learned pretty quickly, was a huge deal on the website. And so in 2003, I needed to do something else, and we didn't have a prospect writer. We had like a small prospect section, and we would occasionally populate it if one of our beat writers did something in spring training or something. It was few and far between. So I said, how about I do that full time? And I've been doing it since. So it's been 20 years now.
So did that, pivot for you, then prepare you for a book like this in the future? Like you started thinking about, identifying players and that process and talking more to scouts and things like that?
Oh, it definitely did. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to scouts day to day. We rely on them for our rankings, our information leading up to the draft, all of that. They, much as they are the lifeblood of the game, they're our lifeblood for our content, and they're great storytellers. And it really kind of stemmed from, I think it was during the pandemic, we were looking for content, and I did like an oral history piece on how Charlie Blackmon was scouted, mostly because randomly I was talking to a friend of mine, Brian Bridges, who was the Braves scouting director, and he's now the national cross-checker for the Giants. And he was telling me the story about how he had drafted Charlie Blackmon as a pitcher out of high school when he was an area scout with the Marlins, and had completely missed on the fact that maybe he could hit. Everyone did. And after I did that one, I started thinking, like, you know what? There are tons of stories like this. There are tons of stories of guys who, were undervalued or underseen, underevaluated, whatever it is, as amateurs, who then went on to far exceed whatever meager expectations that might come with being a later round pick.
So you profile several different players. In assembling that list, like, did you start looking at, where guys went versus, how they've ended up and, career WAR and stuff like that, and think, what are the best examples of this? Or was there, specifics to each, like Blackmon being someone who was a pitcher first and then showed talent as a batter and became, an all-star hitter. Like, were you looking to kind of look at different avenues in which scouts missed, or like the guys dropped, things like that?
I think it was kind of a little of column A, column B, and column C. I definitely sometimes it would be after the fact. If I heard a story, I'd look to see, what a guy's career WAR is. And most of the stories that came up were known guys. So I knew, Lorenzo Cain had a good career, that Ian Kinsler was really, really good, things like that. But I think, what started happening is whenever I would call up a scout to talk to him about something else, I would say, hey, I did this Charlie Blackmon thing. Like, do you have any stories like that? Do you know of any stories? Scouts love to talk about the guys they missed, the ones who got away. They are more typical to say, you need to talk to this scout from this team, about Jacob deGrom, things like that. So I kind of started amassing stories first, and obviously the names in the book are all very recognizable. So I didn't have to I got to make sure that they were good. The Ian Kinsler story I knew a little bit about. He didn't go until the 17th round, played for 3 different schools. It wasn't until I started digging in that I realized that he actually had the most career WAR of anyone in his draft class. So that obviously made it into the chapter, but I didn't pick him solely because of that.
Right. So it initially starts then, it sounds like, as like almost a fishing expedition with these scouts that you're obviously talking to them for your day job with the pipeline stuff and, asking the pressing questions you need for those stories, but then saying, hey, like, well, I've got you on the line. Do you have something I can stash away or, an avenue I can explore?
Yeah. And then sometimes they, their institutional memory tends to be good, but some of them have been doing it a long time. And all of a sudden they'll think of something later on. And then some of the things didn't totally work. Brian Bridges told me the great story. Buster Posey, when he was coming out of high school, most people liked him as a pitcher. He was like a command, almost like a Greg Maddoxy, which is, it's ridiculous to put that kind of label, but that was the kind of pitcher he was. Athletic on the mound, didn't throw super hard. He said the crazy thing about that for him is that he knew he was a good hitter. He would coach the East Coast Professional Showcase Georgia team every year. And even though Posey was there as a pitcher, he used Posey as a pinch hitter in a key moment. The Georgia versus Florida game was always huge at that showcase. And he used Posey to pinch hit with the bases loaded, and he hit a double off the wall. And it still didn't occur to him, oh, maybe I should look at him as a hitter. He then went on to I forgot who it was, drafted him late, as a high schooler. He went on to Florida State. He had never caught until he got to Florida State. So that was an added thing. But the ability to swing the bat was one of those, just he missed it. So that didn't really fit into this book because Buster Posey ended up being the number 5 overall pick. But, for every 7 stories someone told me, 3 of them could have fit in the book. Because I could probably crank out a few volumes of this if I wanted to.
I was going to say this could be a series rather than just an individual book from the numbers of players who've, fallen in the draft.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are stars in every round of every year that come. And, I'm also interested because I cover the draft so closely and the opposite, the guys who were supposed to be good that didn't make it. Maybe eventually I can write that. For a first volume, though, to have a book with a cover of pictures of guys that no one has any idea who they are, I figured was probably not super smart from a sales standpoint, but maybe I'll get to that because those stories are fascinating also for different reasons.
Yeah, you want to have Mookie Betts and Albert Pujols on your cover. That certainly helps sales, right?
Not my first rodeo. So
no, exactly. So you mentioned that they see Buster Posey as a pitcher. They don't conceive of him even after he's hit this game-winning double. That is a recurrent theme in the book, is like seeing a guy a specific way or having slotted him in as something and then being like unable to like change their mind or wrap their head around when the evidence presents itself. Did you talk to scouts about kind of like locked in mindsets and pushing against that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Alan Matthews, who was the area scout for the Rockies, had a great term for it. It's sort of like familiarity bias, but but it's not quite that. The thing that worked in his favor is that he was new, so he never saw Charlie Blackmon pitch. So I think that happens a lot, and even with Buster Posey, listen, every year there are guys, and maybe we're seeing some guys getting the chance to be two-way players now, and maybe someone would have entertained that for Buster Posey back then, but more often than not, the industry leans one way or the other, even if they're talented both ways. And sometimes it all takes is, a team to go, one team to want to go in the other direction. The Braves were the outlier in wanting to let Austin Riley hit. Most teams liked him as a pitcher. What a waste that would have been, looking at what he's done, in Atlanta. So they were right about that. So, I think it could have been the thing that he's a good hitter, but his future is on the mound kind of thing. And that's why they sort of put aside his ability to hit. And the same, with Charlie Blackmon, why more teams weren't on him, even though he hit close to 400. I mean, there's no track record, right? He had never hit ever. And people in the area, because he stayed in Georgia the whole time, couldn't help but think of him as a failed pitcher. And And yes, he put up numbers, but he was a college performer. But I think the fact that Alan Matthews had never seen him do the other thing, made a big difference. And yeah, there are definitely, I think in this book, there weren't necessarily cases like that. Not everybody liked the players who ended up getting drafted. Albert Pujols, famously didn't go until the 13th round.
Didn't like his body.
Yeah, they didn't like his body. He was from a small, high school, small junior college, and in the chapter, I don't want to give away too much. The Rays were a team that did really like him. The area scout loved him, and the Rays scouting director sent in several cross-checkers because the area scout kept sending in these glowing reports, and the area scouts all saw him bad. And so they didn't know what to do. That scouting director, Dan Jennings, changed how he drafted soon thereafter. They didn't have to wait long to get a return on investment because it took Pujols only a year of minor league ball to get to the big leagues, where if an area scout was pounding the table that much in the later rounds, even if the cross-checkers didn't see him as well, he was going to take him anyway. Why not take a chance on someone who's got conviction? So he sort of shifted his mindset in his late round drafting philosophy because of Albert Pujols.
So speaking of pounding the table, I mean, the scout has to be at the table when it comes time to draft for that action to happen, and they're not always in the room. And you kind of talk about like guys, slipping because they didn't have a champion in the room in some instances. Was that a recurrent theme when you were talking to these scouts about, like part of the reason we missed out on this guy is because, maybe I saw him and I didn't have the opportunity to vouch for him on draft day?
Yeah, I focused so much on the teams that got him. So I'm thinking of like Mookie Betts. There were a couple of other teams really interested. And I did talk to Sean Campbell, who was cross-checking for the San Diego Padres. So he was in the room and did talk him up. I don't know if it got to table pounding status, quite yet. The interesting thing with the Red Sox is that Danny Watkins already had a good reputation, and that carried a lot of weight. Tom Allison was a respected scout, but he was new to the organization. And I think if it had been a situation where Tommy had been with the Red Sox for years, he would have been a little more vocal. So some of it's just the dynamic, even if you're in the room, right? He couldn't go up to his new boss, he'd been there a year, and say, you really got to take this guy. He kind of just had to kind of gently be like, maybe we should consider taking him. And Amiel Sade, to his credit, said he even went back and looked at the original reports. He's like, why didn't I take this guy sooner based on the reports? But it's an interesting dynamic because even if the area scout is in the room, there's a certain protocol. You can't start pounding the table too soon. You have to kind of pick your spots. Sometimes there's a hierarchy where maybe he'd have to go to a cross-checker who would then have to go to the scouting director. And then you have to hope that the cross-checker, is sort of in your corner as well. And that's what happened with the Mets and Jacob deGrom. Their East Coast cross-checker saw deGrom and liked him. Nobody knew he was going to throw 100 miles an hour, but have multiple scouts sort of advocating always kind of helps get things pushed across the finish line, even if it takes a little bit longer than it should have in retrospect.
Yeah, folks who haven't read the book and don't fully understand kind of like the way scouting is kind of set up, there's an individual scout who has like a territory, and then the teams have kind of guys who cover a larger turf who then kind of, read those reports, and they're the cross-checkers who, say yay or nay based on those initial scouting reports. And like you said, some guys, organizations, they see the guy on a bad day and then it doesn't add up. Like they, cross that guy off the list rather than reinforce what
Right.
the scout was saying. As a system, it's been a system for a long time, these, kind of territories and the way that the scouts cover things. Have they ever done like a 360 kind of review of like, if we missed on these things because of like how large a territory a cross-checker has to do, and he, has like one or maybe two looks at a guy versus a guy who's there a lot more and sees a lot more of this player, so we don't, miss on a guy or undervalue him?
Yeah, and then the scouting director who oversees all of it beyond, the first couple rounds won't get more than a look at a guy. You may get a later round guy, who you see at a showcase, or you bring him for a workout, or if he's a college player at a conference tournament, but they don't have the time to bear down on, the guys who are going to go a little bit later on. I think they are constantly sort of doing those kinds of debriefs to see where holes might be. It's a very, very imperfect science. This is where I think the advent of advanced data and analytics and video can be useful. I'm saying that carefully because unfortunately I feel that there's some teams who are doing that in lieu of actual scouting of the players, which anyone who's ever talked to me or anyone who reads this book it's pretty abundantly clear where I stand on that, in that argument. I think you need both. I think what could happen if Albert Pujols came through now, first of all, Albert Pujols, because there's so much more showcase baseball now, even where he was, given the circumstances, probably wouldn't have been as unseen. Same with Joey Votto in Canada. So that has changed. But now I think, let's say, Dan Jennings, because his area scout kept saying, I love Pujols, he's the best player in my era, he sent in like high level cross checkers, guys who went on to become scouting directors, really good scouts, repeatedly. In today's world, if those guys went in and be like, I didn't see it, the area scout could then say, well, you need to look at all this video. Maybe there'd be a lot more exit velocity information, even at the junior college level. So I think there could be things that could back up an area scout's claim to help maybe shorten those gaps. Yeah, that would bolster their argument and shorten those gaps where these players fall through. But even if everything was scientific and done completely analytically, you're still going to have guys who go in the 12th round who 15 years later, you look back and be like, that guy should have been a first rounder.
Right. In the same way that you get those high draft picks who burn out, whether it's due to injury or, they meet pitching they can't hit in the AA level or something like that. And part of that, picking the guy in the 12th and he ends up being, first round value is intentional, right? Like you talk about, some teams having their eye on a specific player and no one else, being there and scouting him and thinking he's not on anyone's radar. We can get him later. We can push it down the draft list and go after the high demand guys earlier on.
Right. And nowadays with the bonus pool system that they have in the draft, where you can only spend a certain amount for top 10 rounds, you have to be even more mindful. I think the lucky part of smart, wrong, and lucky is going to come in more in the rounds 11 through 20. But yes, you're usually aware of who else is interested in a player. And the really good area scouts really know. That's what happened with Ian Kinsler and the Rangers, where their area scout, Mike Grouse, just really had a feel and knew that other teams weren't on him. There was one other team that was interested. And when they went in a different direction in an earlier round, he knew he could wait. And he kept telling, they were ready to take him a little bit earlier. This was a weird instance where their scouting director knew Ian Kinsler because he had seen him in junior college. That doesn't happen very often. So there was some familiarity. So that was a little bit of a flipped script, and that the scouting director was like, should we take him now? And, Mike Grouse was kind of saying, no, we can wait. We can wait a little longer. Probably cost Ian Kinsler a little bonus money, but he knew exactly how long they could wait before we're having to worry about someone else taking him.
Yeah, the recap of that draft day, it reads like, like those submarine movies where they're like the incoming torpedo and they're like, wait. And then at the last moment they turn kind of thing. Like it felt.
Yes. Wait until you see the whites in their eyes kind of before you fire back kind of deal.
Right. And Kinsler, as you're right, like kind of a perfect storm of, other shortstops and second baseman prospects. Like he was always kind of like second fiddle on his own team. That there were other guys people were more interested in at every level and every stop. So he was overshadowed. And so, that scout did read the room right in terms of him being outshone.
Yeah, and he only played the 1 year in Missouri and was hurt. So fall ball, he wasn't full strength. I mean, he played, but Mike Grouse was the one who's recognized especially the speed, the agility factor that wasn't there because he was kind of playing through a bit of a broken foot, and no one else there was no track record previously because he had just transferred. He went from high school to junior college to Arizona State to Missouri, right? So he never was in one place long enough or played consistently enough before that spring of his last year at Missouri for people to really get a feel for who he was. And Mike Grouse certainly took advantage of that.
Yeah, and he's bouncing around from like different scouts areas throughout that period, right? Like, so it's like no one gets like one good look at him and can start championing him.
Well, and sometimes what'll happen is a scout from one area will say, hey, this guy just came into your area, keep an eye on it. This would happen with Mason Miller of the A's, who just made it up to the big leagues. He's been hurt a lot of this year, but he digressing from the book, but to show that there are more stories like that. Wasn't throwing very hard, was at Waynesburg State in Pennsylvania, was ready to stop playing baseball, discovered he had diabetes. Once they got that under control, he started gaining weight, started throwing harder, and he found a place at Gardner Webb, and the A's area scout in the Pennsylvania, Ohio area said to the North Carolina scout, you need to watch this guy. And they ended up taking him in the second round, I think, because of that communication. So that does happen. But with Ian Kinsler, like, he didn't play at Arizona State, right? He got taken out of the starting lineup after the first week or two, lost his job to Dustin Pedroia famously, and sat on the bench the rest of the time. So no one knew who he was. So there wasn't even the ability to say, hey, guy in Missouri, keep an eye on this guy, because no one had turned him in that year probably at all.
Yeah. The Mason Miller thing reminds me, because obviously, like, with the health changes, his body changed as a result, and that's projecting body changes is something that comes up with some of these guys depending on the age they were first seen and whether they kind of like grew into themselves, right? Like I'm thinking of like the Lorenzo Cain one, where one scout could see the shoulders and the like speed and add those two things up and say this guy's going to be a rangy outfielder, but that some people looked at him and thought, yeah, he's a bit of a wisp of a thing, and kind of disregarded him, particularly when he had a friend who was considered a prospect and he was tagging along.
Right. If he was by himself, he probably wouldn't have been seen because he came to baseball so late, and was so raw, like he knew nothing and was rail thin. And I think with guys like that, you think, well, are they going to add strength? Billy Hamilton never did, right? He always had the speed. They never needed him to be a power hitter, but he needed to add just enough to impact the ball more, because once you get to the big leagues, that matters. Lorenzo Cain did, the Brewers scouting staff did a fantastic job in recognizing that. It is hard to project what's going to happen. And, this book really only looks at that front end, the scouting and the projecting, and not at the player development part, which obviously is huge for some of these players. The scouts hand them over, and then it's up to the player largely. And all of these guys, the work that they put in to exceed expectations cannot be understated. And player development systems to help them maximize what they do have, right? Jacob deGrom was topping out at 90-91 when he was at Stetson, and was a shortstop. No one projected that he was going to throw as hard as he did, but that was really a testament to him rehabbing after his Tommy John surgery, which happened the summer after he signed, mind you, to turn himself into an entirely different beast. Shane Bieber, the other pitcher I have in the book, also touch and feel command guy who just started throwing harder and harder. And the Guardians have proven to be really, really good at teasing more velocity out of their pitching prospects.
And just identifying pitching prospects in general.
Yeah.
The other thing about the Cain one that I did want to touch upon is the idea of the draft and follow. He was one of the guys. There were several that, this was a practice, obviously stopped through the collective agreement that the draft and follow kind of like everyone hit pause on it for a while. But this practice of, getting a guy late and then kind of seeing what he was and how he developed in, an early year before, having basically a year to sign him if you wanted to. But this practice, maybe you can talk a little bit about that practice and how integral that was to his story.
It's a tool that I think most scouts wish they could still have. And it's back sort of in a modified. There were a couple you could pinpoint, like one or two guys, but if you signed him, you needed to make sure that you still had bonus pool money from the previous year. It's very complicated. There were only a couple guys that were sort of noted as draft and follow guys, and I don't think any of them signed. But the basic idea is for guys like Lorenzo Cain, who were, a little more raw, a little more of a project, that you didn't really see him against great competition for too long. You want to see, especially in that year between age, say, 18 and 19, where your body can change tremendously physically. You want to see how they do against that next rung up of competition. And he struggled at first, but then really started to figure it out. And that's why the Brewers decided to sign him. I think it's happened over the years more with pitchers, guys who are like throwers. Mark Burley was a draft and follow. Andy Pettit was a draft and follow. So you can go and let them see how they do against older competition for an entire spring, because that back then, the signing deadline, you didn't have to sign a guy, who hadn't gone to a 4-year college until like a couple of weeks before the next draft. So you could take that entire spring season to continue to evaluate him.
Yeah, it's a fascinating tool. It's a fascinating book. I don't know if you've ever read $on the Muscle, which I thought was the other really great book about scouting, but that one's from like the 70s. But if you're interested in baseball at all and interested in the history of, how these players got to the bigs, Smart, Wrong, and Lucky, the origin stories of baseball's unexpected stars is a great place to go. Jonathan Mayo, thanks for joining me on the show, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking to you.